I'm Allison Curry. I'm an associate professor at the CHOP Division of Emergency Medicine and also a senior scientist at the Center for Injury Research and Prevention at CHOP. And I'd like to welcome you to our online lecture series, Presenting Your Research. Okay, so I'm going to really talk about two things today. The first is visuals, so slide design, and that's really your the guide to creating the slides, which are really the complement of you as the presenter. And then we'll talk a little bit about presentation flow. We talk about this a little bit in class, and you'll see the that we kind of follow the same template for our presentations as we actually do our written deliverables. Later on in Capstone 2, you'll have the opportunity to watch this again, and then you'll also watch Dominique's online lecture series, which kind of complements this, and that one's on the act of presenting, so kind of you as the presenter. Okay, so let's start with visuals and slide design. So back when I was in undergrad, I would often see this in my syllabi, right? So that's when kind of PowerPoint first started being popular. And what we were taught was that we had these like classic PowerPoint slides, tips, which were no more than 6 words per bullet, no more than 6 bullets per slide, approximately 1 slide per minute, and then something like no more than 3 points per slide. And I still see this in my job today when somebody says, well, I have a 30-minute presentation, and somebody says, okay, well, that's about 30 slides, right? There's this expectation that's like a slide per minute. And I see it all the time when I send my slides for scientific conferences. I have maybe like a 10-minute talk, and I'll send 40 slides, and I always get back something from the moderator. It's like, this is way too long. And I'm like, nope, it's 10 minutes, right? Like I practiced it, I know it, it's like the back of my hand, this is 10 minutes. It doesn't matter how many slides I have, especially when you use animation. You'll see that sometimes I use 6 slides for what really looks like 1 slide on here, because we use slides to kind of tell the story, right? So the first thing I want you to do is forget that this ever existed. And, you know, you'll look at data visualization kind of gurus, and one of the things some of them will say is how much they hate PowerPoint. And I actually don't hate PowerPoint. I don't use PowerPoint anymore. I'll show you what I use a little bit later. But it's not really PowerPoint that's the issue. It's really the issue, right? So when you get into PowerPoint, PowerPoint says, oh, well, I'm going to tell you how to make the slides. This is how you make the slides. You put the title there, and then, of course, you're going to have bullets. So you put all the bullets here, and that's how you make the slide, right? So my first tip is completely forget that. So whether you're using Canva, which I'll talk to you later, that's what I really like, or Keynote or PowerPoint, start thinking of the slide not as this is where my title goes and this is where my bullets go, but really start thinking about it as a canvas, just a blank canvas. I don't know, why can't the title go over here? Does every slide have to have a title? That didn't take long. So we're really thinking about our slides as a canvas that we can help tell our story, right? And that way, the slides become the complement to you, the presenter. So we're really going to talk about like you as the presenter and how the slides cannot serve as a crutch, which I see a lot, right? Like, how am I going to remember my presentation if the words aren't on there because I have to use them for my cues? No, if you've practiced enough and you've really thought through the presentation from a storytelling aspect, these will really complement you as the presenter, but also will keep the shine the light on you and what you're saying. All right, so that's the first tip. This is one of my favorite books. So if anybody, I don't know, you're in the Penn bookstore, they might have it, but this is called Presentation Zen. And it was really the first book that I read that talked about the importance of white space, the importance of simplicity, you know, and you all know this about me because I've talked about it on the written deliverable, that I do think like simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, right? Whatever you can say in 5,000 words, you can say better in 3,000 words. It's the same thing here, right? There is no need to junk up the slide with stuff when really you want the light, again, to be shining on you and be using the slides to help you tell the story. So Presentation Zen, it's a great coffee table book too, for those that are interested in kind of data visualizations. And here's actually the forward of the book that is another person who's very big in the data visualization world. And this is really like what it boils down to is most of the slide presentations we see are long, boring, have tons of bullets, and have pretty bad slides, right? So our goal in slide making really should be short, simple, visually beautiful, and engaging. And again, it doesn't say this, but always remember, we want the audience to be on you as the presenter and really be focusing on what you're saying, not on what's on the slide. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about layout. Again, I'm going to say this over and over again, but simple storytelling, right? So we have these, we all know what's going to happen in a 10, 15-minute scientific presentation. So we all know what's going to happen in your capstone, which is another reason why I really do not like that first slide where people put up, where it's like, first I'm going to tell you about my background, and then I'm going to tell you about my methods. It's like, yeah, we know that, right? Like, get to like compel me with this, with your background. So one of the mistakes that I see a lot of people make is that they think that their slides should be, printed by the audience and taken home, and then they should understand what it is exactly what you said. So there's this, well, I need to put words on this slide so that the readers or the audience can take the slides home and know what I said. That's not the purpose of slides, right? That's like read the paper. The purpose of the slides are to complement and tell your story. So you should not think of the slides as being able to be kind of taken out of the room and like, Maddie, if you took the slides out and then handed it to somebody, they probably have no idea if it's a good presentation, because you really kind of had to be there. But that's why we do oral presentations and then we write papers, right? Because there's like a paper version. So here's an example of that. So this was a slide that I show sometimes at the beginning of my lectures on autistic adolescents who are driving. And the purpose of this slide, it's basically what it says, the urbanicity of the US. And I show the slide to show, I gave this talk in Washington. And so I said something like, well, in Philly and Washington, sometimes we forget just how rural a lot of the country is. And so there is this need to drive for a large proportion of the population in the US. Now, if you took the slide and just left, you could probably guess what the green, yellow, and red are, right? But I don't have a legend. I don't have anything telling you what I was talking about, right? I use this because it was a very poignant slide to say, wow, there's a whole lot of green on that slide. So it helps me make the point that I wanted to, which is so much of the US is actually rural. And I say in the presentation, I say, something like 80% of the population lives in rural areas, as shown in the green area. So I kind of like serve as the legend as I talk. But again, you look at the slide really quick, take away that kind of powerful message of how much green there is, and then your eyes are back on me as the presenter. And you see how much white space there is, right? So again, plenty of white space. The less cluttered the slide is, the more powerful the visual message is. And so this is a slide that you've probably seen a ton of times before, right? Bullet, bullet, bullet. And so in this slide, what I would say is, and this is my work on ADHD and driving. If I was presenting, I would say, ADHD is one of the most common mental health disorders among children. In CHOP patients, the prevalence is about 5% among girls and 10% among boys. And the primary symptoms of ADHD include hyperactivity, inattention, and impulsivity. For about 2/3 of children with ADHD, ADHD persists until adolescence, around the time that they're going to get a driver's license, right? So part of you is like, do I watch Allie or do I like read the slides? And you've probably been in a presentation before where the person is saying something different than that's on the slide, and that causes a little like glitch in your brain, and it's like, wait, they're talking, but like that's not what the slides are saying, so do I listen to them or do I read the slides? And you see that I kind of use, and I'll talk about this later, use this like storytelling aspect by saying, first focus on this, and then I'm going to say this, right? So this kind of, there's a lot of white space, no bullets. I mean, I have given 45-minute presentations with not one bullet. So you may think, like, if you're kind of used to that structure, how do I make a presentation without bullets, right? Like, it can be done, and that doesn't mean that you don't have lists, but you have lists of words, not sentences. Okay, so Edward Tufte, who is a leading expert in data visualization, came up with this word chart junk, which is basically, and so I think of this anytime I make a presentation, it's like chart junk. Nothing on the slide should be there if it doesn't have a specific purpose of being there. Okay, so let's take this slide. I want somebody to tell me, this part's interactive. So tell me what you see on here. And you've probably seen this a bunch, right? Because a lot of people, they just like go to Excel, make a table, pop it in PowerPoint, there it is. You could tell this was made in like the PowerPoint template. Tell me what on here might be an example of chart junk. Yeah, so that's the source, right? But we know, and we've talked about this before, it's fine to put the source down at the bottom in small bullets. There's actually like a double title, right? There's this results, which is a complete waste of title, because you'll know by the time you get this, because you understand what the flow of scientific presentations, that these are my results. Clearly, I'm showing results. And then you have this like very, very wordy title, which, as you said, Catherine, has some redundancies with the graph, right? Like it says 1975 to 2011, but you can see from the graph that it says that, and I can actually just say that. So that is an example of chart junk, yes. I mean, it needs to say something, right? But certainly not that. What's another example? Yeah. Mm-hmm. They do almost nothing, right? If you needed to know exactly what this point was, then maybe they'll be helpful. But both these grid lines and this line that Excel makes over here, which is like the border, are all complete chart junk. They just do not have to be there. Certainly it's nice to have an X and Y axis, right? Sometimes I don't even make a Y axis, but the rest of them just do not need to be there. Yeah. Nope, it doesn't have to be there. So the legends in some respects are important, but one of the things, Sarah, about that does is I want your focus on here, right? This, like, the goal of this is to really talk about how much the crash rate has declined in this 40-year span. And you're looking at the graph, and then you're like, what is that? And then your eyes are off the graph to go to the legend for me to tell you what it is. So you need to know that red is males and blue is females, but it could just be labeled. There's only 2 lines. It could be labeled right on the graph. They don't have to take your eyes off of that picture. So yes, that would be considered chart junk. What else? There's more. Yeah. Yeah, you don't need all of those. You'll see on the slide that I found a way to take all those zeros out, right? It just like kind of looks, it looks busy, right? One more piece of chart junk. Yep, yeah. So this is a tricky one, right? Because a lot of times you'll get, you work for an organization, you'll be like, well, this is our template. I do not put that on every slide because I tell you on slide 1 that I work for CHOP, and you know that I'm, talking. And then I do what bookend. I kind of bookend my logo, which is on the first page, on the kind of the title slide, I tell you that I'm at CHOP. And then on the last slide in my thank you, I also say that I'm at CHOP. But on every slide, it does nothing but serve as chart junk because it takes away from your canvas, right? I want that whole canvas. So there's really no reason to have that on every slide because you don't need to take away the CHOP on every slide. Yeah. So supposed to as you're finally kind of finalizing your presentation that you really do sweat the small stuff. Capstone 1 presentation, we don't worry about like, you know, the font size here is a little small and the font size there, but you want to be able to, at the end, look across the presentation and be like, am I using font consistently? Am I using color consistently? Am I using titles consistently? Okay, let's talk about colors, right? So you want your font color to sharply contrast with the background. One of the classic recommendations is that if you're in a large hall or a dark room, you might want a dark background and a light text. Whereas if you're in a place like where the lights are on, you know, that would be like kind of this, because most of the time the lights are on, a white back and a dark text. I will tell you, I almost always exclusively use a white background. And the reason is because when we start to get to the images, most of the images that you'll find on Google have sort of like a white background, right? And so it's so easy to put these images in because it can get really hard to like move something into Adobe Illustrator and try to remove the background. There are some background, it's getting better and better, like in Canva, what I use, you actually can remove the background. But I always just find that the white doesn't equal boring, right? I think sometimes there's this thought that like, oh, I'll go to PowerPoint and I'll pick from a scheme and I'll use the one with the teardrop and the like swish over here. That's actually all chart junk because then that's space that you can't put anything in, right? So you really want to be able to use the whole canvas. So it's okay to select a non-white background, but it just may take a little bit longer to make the presentation and make it like visually beautiful. I have never gotten bored of a white background because I always bring in the color and the aspects and the visuals elsewhere. And you'll see, actually I don't want to stop this because I'm worried that it'll stop recording, but this actually wasn't the picture that I picked. It was like, there's this, and then there's another picture down here. And I angled the picture so it kind of, and I'll talk about this rule of thirds later, but these are chosen for this spot and this spot. And I put a white box around what was under here because this is the part of the picture that I wanted. So it's just harder to do that if you don't use kind of this clean white background. So you also want to use color and font size to reinforce the logic of your presentation. So there's a lot of different things you can use to reinforce your presentation. Again, from the 30,000 foot view, I decided all my titles will be this dark blue color and will be bolded. And then what I put under that, kind of like the first heading, will be non-bolded blue. And then if I have like a sub list, right, or if you do have a bullet on there or those will all be in pink. So now you're creating a structure for your presentation so that all your audience understands, because it doesn't take the audience long to pick up on the structure, right? Like if I had 3 things underneath, then I know those are the sub of that first kind of heading. Same thing with italics, with font size, with color. You can play all of that to your advantage to really highlight on the slide what you want to highlight. And I talked to you about this last week, and this is something as you're moving through Cap 1 and Cap 2, you want to start to develop a color palette. So I want at the end of Cap 2 for people should show up at your presentation, you know, the eyes, like I think about this stuff all the time. So if I was in the audience at your Capstone 2 presentation, I should be able to tell you at the end what your color palette was. I've seen presentations where somebody has 20 colors throughout the presentation, and it just gets visually very distracting. So you want to have like 2 to 3 complementary colors. You could have, and I say blue and pink and white, and there's a green, these are actually the chop colors. It could be a darker pink and then there's a lighter pink hue, right? But you've got I've got a cohesive color structure and a color palette in my presentation. You want to be thoughtful about a few things. Color blindness, right? So I don't want to see any red and green graphs. Oh, that's supposed to say black. I forgot to change that. But there are certain times that I made presentations for reports for organizations. And I said, well, I want this in color because I want to be able to have these like visually beautiful graphs. But what happens when someone at the organization goes and prints it out in black and white? There are actually color schemes that allow for differentiation of the different colors, regardless of whether it was printed in color and black and white. So lucky for you, there's a lot of tools that you can use to try to think about a color palette. I did have, the other thing that I'll say is you can also find something within your scope, within your presentation that might have a color palette, right? So I had a student in CAP 2 who worked on evaluating the Philadelphia's sugar sweetened beverage policy, and her title slide had this beautiful, crisp, high def picture of a big Coke can, right? So she adapted that or adopted that as her color palette. So her whole presentation was white, black, and red. And so if you have something that works for you, that kind of you can bring in your content, you can use that. This is called Color Brewer. So this is kind of made for maps, but you can see here that there are checkboxes for colorblind safe, print friendly, photocop safe, and then you also can think through like different, this is better for hues of a color instead of like what colors work together. This is Adobe Color. And so this is better for thinking about like color schemes. And what I say is if you don't have a natural color scheme in your presentation, and there are many presentations that do have a natural color scheme, but if not, pick something that's interesting and kind of excites you, right? So you can go to Adobe Color. This one is one that one of my colleagues just told me about that I haven't used, but this is called Coolers. So this is like if you find one color that is meaningful, you can put that color in and it'll show you all complementary colors. So this is something that I want you to start playing with in your CAP 1 presentation if you have an idea. And certainly I would love for your peers, and I will comment on it. But then it's fine, like if during CAP 1 and CAP 2 something happens and you end up in CAP 2 with a totally different color palette. It's fine. But try to make sure you're just like starting to adopt something that's a little structural in terms of your color palette. This presentation, and now all my presentations are done, this is the CHOP color palette. So CHOP actually has a specific color palette. And each of these colors have like different hues, and I know the RGBs of each of them, so I can match them perfectly. Don't forget, you can also do that in PowerPoint with that eyedropper, right? So if you use the eyedropper and the colors and you hover over a color, it'll tell you exactly what the RGBs are. So I like to use the color palette from CHOP, both because I actually like it. I think it's like nice, vibrant colors, but also it's because then I can give it to a colleague and they, if we all are using the same kind of branding that CHOP wants us to, then I can give it to my colleague and the stuff that she had in CHOP branding works. Otherwise, every presentation I do, I have to think of like, now what do I want my color palette to be? So because I like this one and I kind of like to buy into the CHOP branding, this is what I use for most of my presentations. I don't use all of the colors all of the time, but certainly having the hues helps because I do have a lot of graphs. And if I had a graph with like 4 different levels, I kind of need like 4 different hues of green. So that's where these tools can help you. I'm sorry, the icons. So I've also seen like very beautiful presentations that kind of take the icon approach. I think sometimes it's hard to mix images and icons. And like if you were doing a photo elicitation project, you had these beautiful photos that you took or that the participants took, I wouldn't be like using icons on one page and these beautiful visual photos of Philly on the other page. But I have had students that kind of wanted to take an icon approach throughout. And one of the nice things is that a lot of the icons, you can actually change the color. So these were like colors that I selected. And so that's nice. So, and you can find tons of icons. You can actually go to flat icon, or you can even type in vaccine rates icon, and then you'll just get a bunch of icons. So you shouldn't have any trouble being able to find high-def images these days. Again, you want to use the image as part of the visual presentation, not as an afterthought. So I've seen so many presentations that it would say something like provider family discussions, right? And it'd be somebody talking about how important the relationship is between the patient and the provider and the family. And then you get to the slide and there's like 6 pictures of different, it's almost like they just like, cut stuff out of a magazine and made a collage of pictures. There's really no like reason why there are 6 pictures on the screen. So it comes across to the audience more as an afterthought. You just like clipped a bunch of stuff and put it on the slide, right? So images should always be part of the storytelling. So here's an example of an image that I happened to find that I was very excited that I found years ago, because it was a keynote in New Jersey, and I was talking to a bunch of teen driving safety experts in New Jersey. And on this slide, I was making the point that very few states in the US actually share their licensing and crash data with researchers. And I was making the point of just how unique that the structure of New Jersey is. And this was like the perfect slide, right? Because you could see that it helps my presentation, where it's like all the cars are going one way and there's the other New Jersey going the opposite way in a different color, and it happens to have cars in it. So I didn't really, what I was trying to get a point is how the audience should walk away feeling like, wow, we really are special as a state. How do you make a slide about that, right? So this is a slide. It's like you look at it for a sec and then you come back to me. And then I told the story of how unique the state environment was. Here's 3, so these are the 3 other tips that I will show in the next slide. And this is actually a capstone example. So 1, don't select images with backgrounds that are in contrast with yours. So I do not want to see any more pictures where it's like a white background and then like a gray background, and then there's like a hand coming out of the little picture, right? I'll show you how to re-envision that. You want to lead the eye into the picture. So if you've got something where somebody's pointing, you don't want the hand pointing out of the slide, because everybody's eyes naturally go in that direction. So you want to be able to, if there's something that's like pointing, you want it to be pointing like at the words, right? Or you want to draw the eye into the words. And then, does anyone know what the rule of thirds is? It's actually a photography principle, but it's basically like what's most visually appealing is if you imagine that the canvas here is a grid with 9 boxes, right? So you've got 2 lines horizontally and then 2 lines vertically, and it's cut into, it's like the Brady Bunch box, right? So what you want to do is you want to keep the structure within the boxes or right here in the corner, in the intersection of 2 lines. So, and I use this in photography all the time. My husband won't let me take a picture of my 3 kids with them in the center of the photo. You'll see photographers don't ever have someone in the center of the photo. I either have 2/3 and the kids are on the 1/3, or the kids are taking the 2/3. Same thing with the horizon. You never take a horizon picture with it right in the middle. You either do 2/3 sky, 1/3 water, or the other way around. So an example, right, is if you have a slide where you have a list of stuff, and then you want to kind of shake up the background a little bit, because I do that, right? Because white backgrounds are a little bit more, right? So one thing I do is once in a while I'll pop the blue background with the white text, right? So it kind of wakes up the audience. But when you have a slide with some white and some blue background, you've seen those, right? You never do it right in the middle. You do 2/3 blue, 1/3 white, or 2/3 white, 1/3 blue. And you notice, when I had that colors picture with the little coloring kit, the words were here in that intersection, and the little color kit was in the other intersection. And you'll see that throughout my slides, is that you really want to put things so they're kind of the most visually appealing place. I'll show you that. Okay, so here's an example. So this is an actual capstone slide that one of the students way back when brought to Capstone 1 presentation, or maybe it was a Capstone 2 presentation, but there are a number of things that could be improved on this slide. The first, Nobody wants a vaccine after seeing this picture, right? So if you're making the point that vaccines are fantastic, you do not want to be showing a picture of a kid crying with a vaccine, right? So the color choice, the picture choice can improve. This is also, I don't think it's a high-def picture. You've got some pixelation here. And it's also doing that thing that I said where it's like the background is a different color than the slide. So you see this provider hand just kind of like ends, right? And it feels like plopped on, like it feels like an afterthought. In addition to that, when you're thinking about your CAP backgrounds, right, it's so much better to have like one compelling statistic that draws the audience in than this litany of, and then this, and then this, and then this. And so you don't really, like the student didn't need to say both of these things to get the audience on board of the public health importance of vaccines. And then it's very like wordy, right? So it's like 732,000. So it's a little wordy, and also the references are much better off with the sources on the bottom. That way, you really want the text of the presentation to be about what you're saying. So no reference, year. Don't even put the little superscripts, the ones and the twos. You want it clean as possible, and you put the sources on the bottom in like 12 or 14. The other thing you don't do is you don't put the references on the last slide. Have you ever seen that? Where somebody's clicking through and they're like, and here are all my references. And it's the slide of like 10-point font, and then they go right onto the questions. Nobody can see that anyway. So you want the references there because it's important to cite other people's work and even your own work. But you want them like right down here. And so this is the slide that we re-envisioned, right? So you can see the rule of thirds. You can see that the vaccine needle really makes a statement and draws the eye into the picture, into the words. It's a very compelling statistic, but it's not filled with words and numbers. And also I use both bold and font size and color to draw the eye into different places. So the first thing that sticks out to you is the 730K. It's bigger than everything else, and it's in a different color. So same words, right? Just one compelling statistic with some of these design principles. Again, the eye's on there for about 3 seconds, and then it's back on you. Because you're going to say a lot more than that's on that slide, right? But you're not using the slide as a crutch for your cue. And that's a hard thing for some people to get over, right? Because a lot of people have anxiety about public speaking. I do. It's not one of my favorite parts of the job, but I practice, and so I know, and that's the thing. So you can't tell this story without practice, because a lot of times I use the animation and know exactly what's going to come out when. And in order to do that, you've had to really be thoughtful about what you're going to say, right? It can't be like a winged presentation, because then you wouldn't have thought, how do I make these slides? So she said a lot more than was on this slide, but it's very, very sparse, and in that way it's more compelling than a lot of words of this impact and social impact and economic impact. She probably said some of that, but you don't really need more than this on the slide. And then here's another few examples. So I do slides a lot of times where something's kind of coming off the page, so you can like imagine the rest of it, but it's not always like on the page. And this is an example of, one, being able to use words without bullets. Two, this was actually the whole picture. So I just used the picture as the background. So it kind of shook up a little. I don't remember what the colors, this one I did like 10 years ago, but it's nice sometimes to have one where the background is actually the picture, and then you kind of write on the picture. Here's another example, again, of, on this slide, I talk about one of our findings in our work on ADHD and driving, that very few adolescents with ADHD are actually prescribed ADHD med at the time of licensure. And again, you can see that I'm using font size, I'm using color, I'm using rule of thirds, and very, very sparse words. So all the like that's and the thes can really come out. You don't talk in full sentences on the slide. So I would have said adolescents with ADHD had an active prescription at the time of licensure, right? But I go through the slide over and over, and it's like, what can I delete? What doesn't need to be there? Over. And so keep challenging yourself to tighten the same way that we talk about in our background of our deliverable. It's okay to start with more, but you should go through your presentation so many times to really think through, is this as visually helpful to me as it can be? And then here's another one. Again, the picture that I took here from Google was actually an entire odometer, right? But I just wanted to play with it, and I thought it would look cool like that. I mean, they're really like, I am not a creative person at heart. So I also don't want you to make the mistake of, I can't do this because I don't feel creative, right? This isn't always about being creative. It's about using the principles, learning the principles, and thinking about what the best structure of the slide is. So even if like this may feel very different than what you've done in the past, and my suggestion would be just try one thing at a time, right? Say, okay, Allie has shown me a bunch of principles. I'm gonna like do a slide with the rule of thirds and see how it works, right? Or I'm gonna maybe make bullets like I would, and then think of how can I re-envision this slide? How can I tighten it into a list? What words are needed? What's not needed? And that's also like part of CAP 1 and CAP 2, is that we're all here to keep walking you through it and saying that has too many slides, or how about you bring in that picture over here? And so that's the kind of stuff that we'll talk about as we start doing the CAP 1 presentations, and again in CAP 2. Don't forget, in CAP 2, you're actually presenting twice. So at the beginning, so you'll have 3 iterations of your presentation: end of capstone 1, beginning of capstone 2, end of capstone 2. All right, this is just a quick review of font. In presentations, you want to be using sans serif font, not serif. So serif is like Times New Roman. That's much better in text, so that's what your deliverable will be in. But you want your presentation to be in a sans serif font. I put a few examples here. This is kind of why I love Canva, for those of you that like Canva, is because I'm really tired of these same fonts, right? I've been using Arial now for 25 years. So I like the fact that Canva has some unique kind of design-oriented fonts. You want to try to use at least 24-point font, but sometimes it gets a little bit smaller. What we'll do is before your CAP 2 presentation, we'll have somebody sitting in the back of the room and making sure that we can see everything. Try to avoid those slides where you start the slide with, I know you can't see this, but if you have a point and you find this like busy slide and you want the like flow chart, like remake it, try to make it, or try to figure out a way not to, or make it so obvious that people shouldn't read it. And really just say, the only takeaway I want here is that you don't have to apologize. If you have to apologize for people not being able to read, then you should think about re-envisioning the slide. You'd see throughout, right? I use both different colors and also different font size to make the main point and the secondary point. So for me in this presentation, I was like, okay, all of my titles are in 44 blue font, right? And then all the other ones below that, the first line, I'm going to try to make in 28. And then any subpoints I'm going to try to do in 24. Now there might be a slide where that doesn't work, because something like the last word reaches over. You don't want that one word on the second, so I'll be like, all right, well, if I do 22, will it work? I don't think anybody has an eye where they can really tell the difference slide to slide between 24 and 22. But you want to try to avoid, with the exception of the references, of like a very small font. And the exception also is when you're doing like tables and charts, you're going to have to use a smaller font. Try not to have more than 2 complementary fonts. So again, like your color palette, it's almost like you're like, what's my recipe, right? What's my color palette? What's my color scheme? What's my font size? What's my font? And sometimes I do a different font for the text on the screen and the title, but try not to like have a wide selection of fonts throughout the presentation. And then I said this already, like italics, bold, color, font size, all of those can be used to help you make the point that you want to make. Animation can be your friend if it's used wisely, right? So definitely when PowerPoint first arose, like lots of people were making like things like this, where things were like flying in, or like, you know, like look like blinds or something. And I would highly recommend you not to do that. But I use animation all the time, again, for storytelling purposes. So, so you want to use it sparingly, and you want to use it really thoughtfully. So here's an example of how I use animation as I'm talking, right? So we made this to depict the huge data warehouse that I do a lot of my analyses on. We created this data warehouse by linking all these different data sets. So we worked with CHOP Creative Services to make kind of like this picture to depict what's in the warehouse. Many of my presentations, I have to, because it took us 10 years to develop this, right? And we're still developing it. So I have to think about a way sometimes to help the audience walk through how we did this. First, we did this, then we did this, then we did this, right? And it's like all the same, but I'm using this kind of as a point of storytelling. An example, the other day we did a presentations where we were talking about the use of last name and residential address. And so my colleague wanted to say, well, these are the data sets that had last name, and these are the data sets that had a residential address. What you don't really want to try to avoid doing is having one of those laser pointers where you're like pointing at all the things. Sometimes there's people have a tendency to overuse the laser pointer. And the also thing is, like, if you're a little bit nervous, one of the issues that sometimes happen is you get a little bit of a shaky hand, right? Which is fine. But if that happens to you, you really kind of want to make sure your hands are down here. And the minute you put the laser pointer on and you're like this, right, everybody just sees like the shaky laser pointer. So instead, I really don't use a laser pointer. I usually use animation to help walk the audience through the slide. So it's like I say, you know, so we looked at last name, and here are the data sources that had last name. And what I did basically is I created a pink circle that fit it exactly, and I copied and pasted 7 times and like worked on it, you know. But that's just one animation. So in PowerPoint, that would just be the appear, right? In Canva, you don't actually have animation. So what I would do is I would make 2 slides. I would make 2 slides, the first one that has nothing and the first one that has all the bubbles or the circles. And residential address was in these data sets. So you can also see, if I hadn't thought about how I was going to walk the audience through it, like if I was winging it, right, I wouldn't be able to use this. But I really thought, like, how am I going to help the audience walk away understanding which data sets last name was in, or how we did this. And so, and you also want them to happen seamlessly, right? So I don't want this NJ show figure to be over here and over here and over here. So you basically, what you do, say if I had a collection of 7 slides, and I've done this before, all of which are this, you make the last one, and then really like kind of when you're getting towards finalizing your presentation, I like make it 6 times and delete what I want. And it's been very time consuming, because what I've had to do is make white boxes, like, because I've had in my presentations 1 pop up at a time, but there was like no good way to do that. So it's really good use of like white circles and white squares that disappear and like and uncover something. So that's how I do that. But you make the final one and then you work backwards. You don't want to make them in silos, because that's when that's when this figure might be moving around the screen as you transition from one slide to another. Okay, bullets, right? So how do we stop reliance on bullets? The first is you want to you think, like I said before, about erasing unnecessary words and using them sparingly. So this was an actual capstone slide that one of the students came to capstone 2 back when I caught there. Really good information, right? And you can see it really sets up the public health importance of of like mortality among older adults, but it's just really wordy, right? It's hard. It takes longer than 3 seconds to read this, so your attention's not on me, your attention's on reading. So this is one easy thing that you can do, right? You're using structure. And I could say the same thing, the 3 leading causes of death are blah, but you can probably read that in 3 seconds. So there's no reason to have bullets on that, right? So if you all remind me, I think one of my colleagues purchased this, but this is actually a really cool tool, which is 52 alternative to bullet points, right? So there's like an entire deck of cards on things you can do instead of bullet points. And so this person has kind of categorized them into text, shapes, images, and diagrams. So an example is like divider bullets, right? So still bullets, but they don't appear that same, it kind of uses a different structure. So like this, you see how this is also using kind of the rule of thirds, right? So that blue to white isn't directly in the middle of the slide. But also it's like you've got a list, right? And I'm sure it takes more than a minute sometimes to go through this list because they're probably talking about each one of these. But again, it's like you're not fighting between the slides and the presenter. And there's a certain bit of vulnerability and uncomfortableness sometimes that comes with it, right? Some people who are like more uncomfortable in the public speaking are like, well, if everybody's looking at the slides and their eyes won't be on me, and then I'll be the afterthought, and then it'll make me feel more comfortable. So you kind of have to get over that hump of thinking like, no, I am the reason they're here, not because of my slides. So it's perfectly fine to spend a few minutes on the slide, but really just have these core things that you're going to talk through. And again, if I was talking through some of these, I might have one come up at a time, right? Which is obviously harder to do on these slides because they don't have a white background. So how do you cover them up? But you could just make 4 versions of the same slide, and then kind of like have them appear. Here's an example of using circles. So you could easily have that as the title, Why the Digital Offshore Wind Energy Initiative, and 4 bullets. Promote plans to partners, right? This like just an alternative to bullets that looks new and engaging. I've had this like, Sabrina, I read your deliverable this morning, so it's kind of on my mind, or like, what are the consequences of C-section, right? And you had like a list of a bunch of stuff. Those could all be in something like this so that they don't feel like you're listing. And the point of that slide is for the audience to say there's a whole lot of negative consequences, not to be able to read each one of them separately. You're not going to talk through all of them, So that might be a way that you can re-envision that list. And then I would ask you to think beyond PowerPoint if PowerPoint is something that you're just not jazzed about. I've been using Canva for years now. My whole team uses it. It's a little bit different. It's much more like drag and drop than PowerPoint, but I love it. It's got a design approach, so you can make like both presentations and wedding invitations and posters all in Canva. So there's a little bit of a learning curve associated with it because it doesn't have animation. So I love it. So if any of you are thinking about kind of moving outside of the PowerPoint space, some of you may also use like Keynote or something, but I made this in PowerPoint so I can show you all that you can obviously make a beautiful presentation in PowerPoint. I just like the way Canva feels better. And after making 25 years of presentations, I'm like, it has to be fun, right? And PowerPoint just stopped feeling fun to me. Okay, so presentation flow. We've talked about this before, right? But presentations are very much the same as your written deliverables, where you start off in the background with the public health importance, right? The what's known. There should be a critical gap slide. It doesn't have to say critical gap on it. In fact, it might be better that it doesn't. Right? And then you've got a succinct, clear objective slide. The objective slide is the one that I don't want you to have anything else on, really, because you want, and we all practice that, right? Because we've already had like our examples of objective slides. But the objective slide is the one that I don't want you to think outside the box on. But I do want you to take away like the thes and the that's that aren't needed and think about if I have is this exposure associated with these 3 outcomes? Instead of writing it out, right? You have outcome 1, outcome 2, outcome 3. So work on how to best convey that. But it's the same thought, right? And then your results. And then you work back out in the discussion. Maybe you have like a summary of the results, the implications, the limitations, the next steps. So that's why I was telling you all, when you're kind of moving throughout capstone, you're moving iteratively between your written paper and your oral presentation, because they're really kind of just mirrors of each other. So if you have a eureka moment on your presentation through, or peer review, you leave the peer review being like, this is a tangential point, and everybody agreed, and I totally agree. You go back and be like, did I need that? Is that tangential point in my written deliverable? And maybe that's how I help get down to 400 to 500 words. When you present, you want to know your audience, right? So I've seen so many times where presenters show up to the leading traffic safety conference, and their first slide is that motor vehicle crashes are the #1 cause of death in teens. And we're like, but we're all traffic safety experts. Like, we all know that, right? So I would do that if I was presenting my capstone, because you're doing fetal medicine, right? And you're doing preterm birth, and you're doing global health. So it's a very diverse public health audience, but few probably know the compelling traffic safety details. So you should think about your capstone in that respect. If I was presenting for a bunch of epidemiologists, I would say things different in my results section. Then there's this one conference I go to that's all practitioners, right? So I don't have a slide that's like, I did a logistic regression model, because it doesn't mean anything to them. I focus much more on the implications and the practical applications of my findings. So always know your audience. Again, work on the logical flow, and that's stuff that we work on all the time in capstone throughout, is thinking about tightening. Logical flow, right? You've all done a great job of starting to identify that critical gap. So that should be a transition slide between the background and the short, succinct aim. And again, when we do the presentations, my goal is, if I was Cap 2 instructor, would be when you are talking to the audience and you get to that critical gap slide, you want everybody in the audience to be thinking, somebody needs to do that. Somebody needs to evaluate that. Somebody needs to evaluate that program. And then you come up with your short, succinct aim that says just that. So when you're constructing your backgrounds, really work towards that kind of scientific justification for that aim. That make sense? So what I don't want you to do, and this is true even for this presentation that's coming up, right? I don't want you to open PowerPoint and start making slides. I want you to think about your story. So you could do that in a number of ways, right? You can get index cards and be moving them all around to think like, what's the logical flow through my background? And you've all been thinking about this because you've all now got great backgrounds and background outlines that I've been reading. So if you were to, so you should start with that as the thought of your story, right? There's, this is on Stephanie Evergreen, who's another one of my favorite data visualization experts. And she's got a fantastic blog. So I would really suggest, if you're kind of interested in this stuff, that you go to her blog. It's like very entertaining at the same time, but she really has a lot of examples about how to visualize data. But she has this planning sheet, and it's like, what do I want the story to be? You know, if you're somebody who just likes to work electronically, what I would suggest is you immediately get into slide sorter. So slide sorter is like one of your best friends. You use it at the beginning to start planning your story. You use it all the way through you're about to present, and you put the slide sorter up and you're like, does this look like a cohesive color palette? Are all my titles kind of in the same place? You know, if you forget, you have a title in the middle and you're like, oh no, I have to. So you can see this is one of my presentations, and I look at it, I'm like, yeah, you can see my color palette, right? You can see, I can kind of see everything from that 30,000 foot view. So what you could do is open the slide sorter, if you're using PowerPoint, and write on slide 1. Okay, I'm going to do that on this slide, and then I'm going to do this. You know, just kind of write out the words and make sure that it's working, and then you go ahead and build the story. But like I said, a lot of you have a great start on this through your background outline, so you shouldn't be doing this in a silo. You should pull up your background outline and start using that to craft this. Here's another book that I love called Slideology. Nancy Duarte had made the slides for An Inconvenient Truth, which was that Al Gore documentary. So this is where I first saw these like beautiful slides. I was like, that was done in PowerPoint. Like I still have this like negative thought about PowerPoint at that time. But she has this 3-second rule that I've been telling about. So ask yourself whether your message can be processed effectively within 3 seconds. The audience should able to quickly ascertain the meaning before turning their attention back to the presenter. So I want you kind of to use that as your guide. Okay, graph figures, right? Again, I want you to sweat the small stuff. I showed you on that chart junk slide that sometimes it's a little harder to make the things that are visually beautiful. But I want you to try to go that extra mile over the course of the capstone to really have the most engaging presentation that you can. Think about whether you can use graphs instead of just words, because they're really easy to adhere to that 3-second rule. If I'm looking at, I could say teen driving rates have decreased 75%, but when you see that slide with the graph, it's like much more compelling. You want to, again, use your titles wisely. So we saw that, right? Not just like results or really use it to kind of convey your message. You can use animation through your graph. So there have been also times where I've got like 4 things on a graph, but it's like so much to take in. So I just show one at a time. And you also should think about the results slide. You really do need to orient the audience to your slide. So you pop something up and it's a graph. And you may need to say, so what you're looking at here is a graph of blah, blah, blah. On the x-axis, I have this, and on the y, like kind of like an orientation. And then keep asking yourself, what's chart junk? Do I see more chart junk? What can I get rid of? What can I simplify? And this is that Stephanie Evergreen has a book. She's got a blog, so you don't need the book. This is like one of my favorite books also, and this is all about presenting data. But again, if you just hop on her website, you can find a ton of information. She has this thing called a data visualization checklist, which is like, how good is my data visualization? It's kind of like the Strobe or the Prisma checklist. It's like, did I do this? Yes. Did I do this? Yes. And it helps you think through like what makes a beautiful, rigorous graph. This is the other fun thing that you might want to do, right? So as you move through Capstone 2, you'll start thinking of, oh, I have to display this data. How do I display this data? If you think about your table 1, right? What you don't want to do for your table 1 is take it out of your written deliverable and pop it on the slide. What may be like slightly better, but still not effective, is making one of those Excel tables. And I've seen these, and also it always rings a little bit like phoning it in for me when I see one of those Excel graphs. You know the Excel graphs when it's like has like a dark blue and a light blue row and a dark blue row? Somebody who just like did the defaults, right? But it is better than just like plopping the white and black and white version from the written deliverable in. An even better approach is to think like what can I do that might feel a little bit different, right? So if you think about your standard bar graph, this graph over here, this lollipop graph, is also just like a different way to envision the bar graph. And so you may want to think about making your table 1 like a visual bar graph. Like 40% were females, right? So you have a 40 and 60% bar. And the good thing about this is for each one of these, if you go on stephanieevergreen.com, she shows you how to do this in Excel. So you don't need to be a programmer to do this. She has the template in there in Excel. And then you can, of course, just pop that over into PowerPoint. Make sure you're still using your color palette. So your color palette might be in PowerPoint, but then you have to like go to Excel and put your color palette in there to make sure the blue matches the other blue. But try to, as you're moving through Capstone 2, try to figure out maybe you can use a cool graph. They even have ways to visualize qualitative data, which is super cool for those of you that you think, oh, I can only visualize data when I'm doing quantitative stuff. But there's also really cool visualizations for qualitative data. This is the quantitative chart, but there's another qualitative one on her website. And again, here's just an example of a graph that that kind of goes through all the principles, right? No chart junk, things are labeled. Throughout my whole presentation, pink is always the ADHD group and blue is always the no ADHD group. So I don't want to go different, right? I'm using color to my advantage to say, these are the two groups, and I'm going to make that consistent throughout the presentation. And it's got a really it's got a title that, that is meaningful and informative. Here's another example. So some of you are making flow charts. You could do this for your systematic reviews, right? Where you don't plop the written deliverable flow chart in here. You think of how's best to visualize it on the oral presentation. And these are so easy to make. And finally, ending the talk. So in your capstone, I really want you to acknowledge your mentor and not just say thank you to your mentor, but find like a nugget to say about your mentor, right? Because they're investing time in you and in an unfunded capacity to support you. And so when you're doing your last capstone slide, I don't want you to like phone in that acknowledgement to your mentor. It's fine to do that. I'd love to thank my capstone 1 and my capstone 2 instructor and my whoever you want, but that mentor one should be meaningful, and so think of something to say nice and meaningful about your mentor. Thank them first. And then you want to end the presentation with a simple thank you slide, right? You don't have to bring up that question slide. It could say questions, but it'd be better if it had your email on it, so that if there's someone in the audience that was like, I might need to talk to that person because I love what she does, or maybe I want to hire her, and then you have your email on there. It also provides a kind of a stop for the presentation. It's like an obvious end, so you don't have to like end awkwardly, and I'm done, right? And it also provides a visual aid that's pretty during the question period. Try not to like use the clip art, that like there's some like clip art that people do for the question slides. It's like make it visually beautiful, just like every other slide. And then on the other side of that landing slide will be any of the back pocket slides that you have. And those are usually things that like if your capstone 2 peers keep asking about the same thing, but it's clear that you don't have time to put it in the 10-minute presentation, put it in the back pocket slide, right? You should never delete a slide. So if you come to Cap 2 and you're trying to get it down and it's 10 minutes, 12 minutes, and then you have to delete 3 slides, put them in the back pocket so that they're there. If somebody asks a question about that, you'd be like, actually, I have a slide on that, right? So you've already kind of thought through what the questions are. So I always end up with a bunch of back pocket slides. And sometimes even if I know I have one and I could easily answer the question, I don't, because it does take a little bit of you have to go back into the slide sorter, and then if you've got 12 back pocket slides. So 2 or 3 back pocket slides that might have been in the presentation but had to come out at the last minute could be in there. So here's an example of that. And now we have, at my team, we always use a QR code. And I've seen lots of people at my presentations take pictures of that. And maybe it goes to our homepage with all our research findings on there. But this is one of those cool Canva fonts. But just a simple slide like that could just say questions, after your acknowledgement slide.